Hi, my name is Dr. Michael Bardot, and I'd like to welcome you to the lecture that's on Mesopotamia from the years 3000 BCE until 539. If we start by taking a look at a couple of maps, we can identify a couple of key areas that we're going to be talking about. The area that we call Mesopotamia, which means land between the rivers, is basically the area of land that is traditionally identified between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. And if we look at this map, we'll see that it's actually, on this map is a map of modern day Iraq in terms of its political boundaries. And that kind of gives us an idea of where we're located. So we're looking at basically the land extending up from the Persian Gulf up through the Middle East and then kind of curving over, if we look at this map, curving over to reach almost the Mediterranean coast below the body of land we call Asia Minor. Now, in terms of the civilizations we're going to talk about, what I want to do is I want to identify a couple of key facets or key components of each civilization, and I will leave the bulk of the material to be basically gained from the online materials in the Lumen Learning, Boundless.com World History Hub. Those materials can contain a lot more information that I can actually go through in terms of these podcast lectures. I could actually take the time to do that, but we'd be looking at lectures that are probably anywhere from, give or take, probably from an hour to like an hour and 15 minutes, which is a pretty long time to sit in front of a computer. So what I've tried to do is I've tried to kind of break it down and talk a little bit about each cultural system, each government empire, if you will, and then kind of make our way over the course of about 2,000 years from the early civilizations until we reach kind of that year 539, which is the end of what's called the Neo-Babylonian Empire, which was the last Mesopotamian government based in the region. Excuse me. So if we take a look, our first, what we call proto-culture, is called the Sumerian culture. Now, Sumer itself was a city located in the region, and Sumerian culture was kind of the base culture of all of the groups of tribes and peoples that lived in Mesopotamia. The written language that developed over the course of some couple of hundred years was the written language we call cuneiform, which was a pictographical language, which means that was a language based exclusively on pictures as opposed to letters or other types of material. In terms of the government, what developed in the Middle East and what was the overarching cultural pattern was a system of what we call city-states. That would be a city that governed the land around it. Each city in Mesopotamia would have contained its own military, its own monarchy, its own economy, its own coinage in terms of the money it used, etc. Now, it would have shared a religious tradition with the other Mesopotamian city-states, but they would have focused primarily on one deity, one god or goddess, or a particular aspect of the religion that kind of set them religiously apart. Since we've mentioned the topic of religion, the religion of the Mesopotamians is what we call polytheistic religion. And what that means is that the Mesopotamians worshipped a series of gods and goddesses, or what we call a pantheon of gods and goddesses. And again, each city-state would basically worship a particular set of gods and goddesses that were kind of the hometown god or goddess of that city. As we're looking at kind of these very basic early civilizations, we can definitely identify that there was a system of law operating in the city-states of Sumer, as well as basic intellectual achievements that we call, for example, practical or real-world application mathematics, the ability to irrigate crops and to manipulate water, and finally, the building of large-scale architecture that we commonly refer to as monument architecture. Now, the Sumerian civilization operated from about 3500 through the 2000s. But as in terms of a political distinction or as a political power, the rise of a rival empire known as the Akkadian Empire would basically attack the Mesopotamian Sumerian cultural areas and assume political control. And so, if we take a look, we have the creation of the first empire of the Middle East under Sargon of Akkadia, approximately in the year 2400 BCE. We don't know a whole lot about the Akkadians. Much or most of their cultural aspects and their language did not survive the empire of Akkadia. And in fact, what we can kind of tell from the list of materials and the surviving materials that we have is that after the conquest, the Akkadians, as they began to kind of settle into Mesopotamia and rule there, their language was actually abandoned in favor of the more developed and stable cuneiform language. And as a result, we also see a lot of their cultural aspects kind of abandoned as the conquerors, if you will, became enculturated, or means that they adopted the culture of the people they conquered. The empire was fairly short-lived, about 200 years, because once again, that kind of pre-existing cultural pattern of independent city-states would once again kind of re-emerge and kind of take over as the empire kind of decayed and fell apart. We have our second empire, which is created about 200 years later, which is the so-called Old Babylonian Empire, which is to differentiate it from a much later Babylonian empire called the Neo-Babylonian or the New Babylonian Empire. It's the same group of people, but we use these terms old and new to kind of describe two distinct and separate forms of government that existed at two different times. Now, in terms of the culture and kind of nature of Babylonia, Old Babylonia, we really kind of highlight the reign of their what is considered to be their greatest king, Hammurabi. Hammurabi, who reigned from 1792 to 1750, is not only kind of credited with stabilizing and creating the empire, but he's also accredited with what's called the Hammurabi Code, which is our first written law code in human history. It dates to, again, around the time period of the 1700s BCE, and it represents our first written law code. Now, if you remember, I mentioned the Sumerian law code. We know they had one, but we do not have written copies of it. The actual first written copies we have of a law code are the Code of Hammurabi, and let me move that just for a minute. And the reason or the way that we have this code surviving is that Hammurabi actually copied it onto giant 6 to 7.5 foot stone markers and placed it throughout his kingdom. And that was, of course, obviously so people within the kingdom could know what the law was, but also what the Code of Hammurabi represents is the first time we can kind of see and prove that the government actually took ownership of the law as opposed to a religious judge or a secular judge kind of controlling and dictating the outcome of the law. What we have, if you can see on the top of the stylus here, is we can see Hammurabi receiving the code from the Sumerian or the Babylonian goddess of justice. And that then represents that now the government of Hammurabi, the Babylonian Empire, now becomes the protectors of justice and order, which is a very interesting and a very powerful tool that governments would use. Because we have a copy of the Code of Hammurabi, we know a lot about Babylonian civilization. We have the code. We can see what's going on in terms of the laws that are being enforced and the punishments involved. Now, it's also during this flowering of the Babylonian Empire that we have two major literary works. We have the so-called Enuma Elish, which is the Babylonian creation story, and kind of details the rise of the god, the Babylonian god Marduk, and also kind of identifies certain cultural aspects. what we learned from the Enuma Elish, probably most specifically or possibly most importantly, is that the Babylonians, and by extension probably the Sumerians and Mesopotamians in general, had a very negative view of water. The main goddess of chaos is Tiamat, who's the goddess of water and death. And that's a very interesting kind of thing, because if we parallel that to when we talk about Egypt, we'll see that in the Egyptian religion, Isis, the goddess of water, is the goddess of life and fertility, and generally considered to be the best goddess in the Egyptian religion, as opposed to what we have in the Mesopotamian religion, which is Tiamat being the goddess of death and chaos. The Epic of Gilgamesh is on the PowerPoint, and the Epic of Gilgamesh represents one of the first major pieces of world literature. It dates to the 1900s or 1800s BCE, and it represents our first kind of work of fiction that is what we call the first or the primordial piece of world literature. Now, as is the case with the old Babylonian Empire, after the reign of Hammurabi, the leadership of the empire grew weak, and the empire eventually broke apart. And it broke apart into a time period that we refer to as the time period of the lesser empires. And I've identified a couple of these lesser empires primarily for their particular cultural importance. One of the first empires to kind of develop in the north, it's located on this map represented as the blue, would be the Hittites. And the Hittites were, they were the people that brought iron and the Iron Age to the Mesopotamians. And the Hittites built an empire based on their superior technology. And as you can see, it lasted for about 500 years, from the 1700s to about the 1200s. And their main importance is the introduction of this iron, as well as ushering in kind of a technological innovation and change that we call the Iron Age. Not to be outdone, we also have the rise of another civilization, which is called the Assyrian civilization, which was located to the south of the Hittites. And the Assyrians, or as they are called today, of course, the orchestrators or the foundation of the Syrian state, the Assyrians were primarily known for their reliance on torture and terror to create not a stable government, but a very strict and controlling government. Most people don't realize that it was not the Romans that actually invented crucifixion, but it was actually the Assyrians. And the Assyrians were kind of extremely harsh when it came to dealing with not only their own people, but also people that they basically conquered. The Assyrian Empire, as an empire, goes through periods of growth and stability, which might last 200 or 300 years, and then a period of kind of upheaval and kind of weakness, in which the empire shrinks back to the borders of Syria due to internal conflict and kind of problems that came about from this extremely harsh, strict government. And again, this is just a synopsis, so I definitely recommend that you guys take a look and read into the Lumen Learning Boundless World History Hub and learn more about the Hittites and the Assyrians. Our last kind of lesser empire that I want to talk about were a group of people known as the Phoenicians. Now, the Phoenicians rose to power located in the land we call the land of Canaan, which you might be familiar with if you're familiar with the Old Testament. So the Phoenicians or Phoenicia, was a Canaanite civilization, but rather than try to create a dominant land-based political empire, as you can kind of see from the map here, the Phoenicians focused on creating an economic empire, focusing on their ability to sail and kind of creating the first Mediterranean trade empire. Now, what characterized the Phoenician political organization was just like Mesopotamia. They were made up of several smaller city-states that were kind of unified by culture and worked together to kind of further the larger goals of the Phoenician society, which was to create this strong economic empire. But that's not to mean that they didn't necessarily compete with each other and also you know, work against each other in some respects to maximize their own power. Now, the reason why I have the Phoenicians on the outline is primarily they would usher in a dramatically significant technological or cultural innovation, which we call phonetic language. And what that means, very simply, is that the Phoenicians were the first people to break away from that old model of creating languages based on pictures, which are not able to be really read by anybody who's not familiar with what the pictures mean. And they made a shift to what we call a phonetic or a sound-based alphabet system, where you would put together sounds written on paper, written sounds, written symbols of sounds that would combine to create words. Now, the reason behind this was the overarching drive of the Phoenicians to trade with everybody. And that necessarily meant they had to communicate with everybody. Rather than try to learn every single group of people's languages from an outside perspective, which they would have extreme trouble with in terms of those, again, pictographical languages, the Phoenicians created a very basic, simplistic, phonetic language that could then be used and taught to everybody. It was fairly simple to learn and very, it was very intuitive. It could be taught to other peoples, and then that would form the basis of exchange and the basis of trade. And in terms of world history, the significance of this is that once this phonetic alphabet was tried out, the use of phonetic alphabets spread throughout the Mediterranean, throughout the Mesopotamian area, extending and finally reaching areas of the Orient, such as China. And once everybody got kind of situated or got familiar with this idea of phonetic alphabet, that revolutionized language, because predominantly, or pretty much within about 1,000 years, pictographical language had practically disappeared. And you got to remember, I don't think I mentioned this, but when you have a written language, which is pictographical, you would also have a secondary language, which was spoken, which would be, of course, phonetic. And the two wouldn't match, which I know seems odd to us, but the two wouldn't match. And so you wound up in the ancient world during the pre-Phoenician days, you wound up basically dealing with two separate languages in your own culture. But when the Phoenicians came along, they revolutionized that idea by creating one written phonetic or sound-based alphabet. And as you can imagine, it's extremely, extremely powerful. Because if you just analyze our phonetic alphabet today, we have approximately 26 letters. But out of those 26 letters, through different combinations, we can create tens of thousands, if not millions, of words. And that's important because if you created that many words in a pictographical based language, that would mean that you would have to memorize tens of thousands of symbols or pictures just to represent the word that you want to use. So as far as innovations go, the use of phonetic alphabets by the Phoenicians and then which spread to other people was a groundbreaking, game-changing linguistic innovation which forever altered the history of human communication and language. I see that we're approaching about 18 minutes on the clock here, and I do want to try to keep this under 25 minutes to kind of facilitate your ability to listen to this and kind of keep track of it. Now, our last topic we'll talk about are once again those Neo-Babylonians, the rise of the Babylonian state. It rose up in opposition to the harshness of the Assyrian Empire. The Neo-Babylonians basically organized a revolution against the Assyrian Empire, against those horrific forms of torture, and they were able to destroy the Assyrian Empire, and then in a very short period of time, they were able to basically resurrect the same size of an empire, which we call the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And if you take a look at the map here, let me move this video box out of the way. If you take a look at the map, it pretty much incorporated all of Mesopotamia, much like the Assyrian Empire did. However, one of the key points, if you will, or important ideas or events within the Babylonian Empire, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, was the conquest of the Hebrew city-state we call Judah, and the incorporation of the Hebrews, the ancient Hebrews, as a slave population within the Babylonian Empire, and that period of slavery that was conducted by the Neo-Babylonians is commonly referred to in the Bible and in other sources as the Babylonian captivity of the Jews. It lasted about almost 50 years, and that brings us up to about the year 539, which it basically we have a turning point in terms of Middle Eastern history, in which we have our first non-Mesopotamian empire created. And I'm pointing to an area on the map. There's no words there, but if there were, this would basically be called the land of Persia or the Persian kingdom. And what happened in 539, which we'll talk about, is that the Persians became extremely militarily stable, and they then launched a series of attacks, which would actually ultimately result in the conquest of the Neo-Babylonian Empire and the creation of a giant empire, which basically was about this big, and we'll see on a map when we talk about Persia, of the so-called Persian Empire. Just to kind of close the book on the Neo-Babylonians, King Nebuchadnezzar II, he is considered to be the greatest of the Babylonian kings, Neo-Babylonian kings, I should say. And you might have heard of the so-called Hanging Gardens of Babylon, which Nebuchadnezzar built as a wedding gift to his new bride. Unfortunately, we have several accounts that tell us that it was extremely complex and ornate and beautiful. But the Hanging Gardens of Babylon did not survive the series of wars that took place at the end of the Neo-Babylonian Empire. So we have drawings and pictures and descriptions of the Hanging Gardens, but we do not actually, they have not survived, and as such, we don't know exactly what they were like. Well, that brings us to the close of our Mesopotamian lecture. If you have questions, please email me. If you want to know more about a particular civilization and the Lumen Learning materials aren't answering all your questions, please send me an email and let me know. But that's going to kind of close the book on our first area of civilization, the first area that farming was created, the area we call Mesopotamia. It's called also the Fertile Crescent, and today we refer to it as the Middle East. Thank you again for taking the time to watch and listen to this video. I hope that it's been informative, and I look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.